The German prisoners stood behind the wire, watching the horizon. They had been captured in the final weeks of the war, exhausted and defeated. The rumors had spread through the camps quickly. There would be no food. Some said it was deliberate policy, revenge for what Germany had done. Others said the Allies simply had no supplies to spare for enemy soldiers when their own populations were starving. In the days after surrender, the prisoners received almost nothing. A few hundred calories, sometimes less. Men who had survived years of combat began to weaken rapidly. They dug holes in the ground to sleep in, huddled together against the cold spring rain. The camps were often just open fields surrounded by barbed wire, with no shelters, no latrines, no infrastructure at all. The prisoners had expected hardship, but not this. They had heard stories of American and British generosity, of the Red Cross and international law. Instead, they found themselves in what felt like a deliberate attempt to make them suffer. Some camps held tens of thousands of men in spaces meant for thousands. Disease spread quickly in these conditions. But then something changed. Trucks began arriving at the camp gates. At first, the prisoners didn't believe what they were seeing. American soldiers started unloading crates of rations, setting up field kitchens, distributing food in quantities they hadn't seen in months. Change came suddenly, as if someone high up in the command structure had realized what was happening and intervened. The food wasn't luxurious, but it was food. Rations, rations, bread, canned meat, coffee. The prisoners ate slowly at first, their bodies unable to handle normal portions after weeks of near starvation. Some became ill from eating too quickly. Medical personnel arrived with the food supplies, setting up aid stations to treat the worst cases of malnutrition and disease. Word spread through the camps that General Eisenhower had ordered improved conditions. The policy of minimal rations was being reversed. Shelter materials arrived, tents and lumber. Work details were organized to improve sanitation. The transformation took weeks, but it was dramatic. Men who had been preparing to die began to recover. The prisoners learned later that there had been intense debate among Allied commanders about how to treat German POWs. Some argued for harsh conditions as punishment and deterrent. Others insisted on following the Geneva Conventions, even if Germany had not always done so. The final decision came from the highest levels of command, driven partly by moral concerns and partly by practical considerations about preventing epidemics and maintaining order. Not all camps changed at the same pace. Some commanders were more sympathetic than others. Some regions had more resources available. The French camps, in particular, maintained harsh conditions longer than American or British ones. French authorities felt they had earned the right to treat German prisoners roughly after years of occupation and brutality. The prisoners themselves struggled to understand what had happened. They had expected punishment, even death. Instead, they received something closer to what international law actually required. Some attributed it to American decency. Others saw it as pragmatic policy. Most were simply grateful to be alive and eating regularly. The camps gradually became more organized. Educational programs started. Work assignments were distributed. Letters from home began to arrive, though many prisoners learned their families were missing or displaced. The German postal system had collapsed entirely. Whole cities had been destroyed or occupied by Soviet forces. As months passed, the camps evolved into holding facilities where prisoners waited to be processed and eventually sent home. The repatriation process was slow and complex. Millions of German soldiers had surrendered in the final weeks of the war. Processing them, checking their backgrounds, determining who could be released and who might face war crimes charges. All of this took enormous time and bureaucratic effort. The prisoners who had been closest to starvation recovered slowly. Some carried the physical effects for the rest of their lives. Dental problems, digestive issues, weakened immune systems. They had come within days or weeks of death, then been pulled back by a policy decision made in some distant headquarters. Years later, some of these men would tell their stories. They would describe the terror of those first weeks after surrender, the certainty that they had been condemned to die slowly behind barbed wire. Then they would describe the trucks arriving, the food being distributed, the sense of reprieve. They would struggle to explain the emotional whiplash of those weeks, from despair to hope in the space of days. The historical record shows that conditions in Allied POW camps varied enormously in the immediate post-war period. Some prisoners were treated well from the start. Others suffered terribly for weeks or months before conditions improved. The worst period was generally April through June of 1945, when the sheer number of surrendering German soldiers overwhelmed Allied logistics and planning. The prisoners in the fields watched as their circumstances changed. They built shelters from the materials provided. They organized themselves into work details and camp governments. They played cards with decks donated by the Red Cross. They wrote letters home and waited for replies that often never came. They gradually accepted that they would survive, that they would eventually return to Germany, though what they would find there remained uncertain. The food kept arriving. Regular rations, sufficient calories, medical supplies. The camps remained unpleasant, crowded, muddy, strictly controlled, but they were no longer death traps. The prisoners gained weight, regained strength, began to think about futures rather than just survival. They argued about politics, about who was responsible for the war, about what would become of Germany. Some prisoners held in American camps would later describe their treatment as fair, even generous given the circumstances. Others, particularly those held by French or Soviet forces, experienced continued hardship and labor exploitation for years. The Western Allies generally moved toward compliance with international law, while the Soviets used German POWs as labor for reconstruction. The moment when the food arrived remained fixed in memory for many prisoners. It represented not just physical survival, but a recognition of their humanity. They had been enemy soldiers, but they were still human beings entitled to basic treatment. That principle had nearly been abandoned in the chaos and anger of 1945, then reasserted by commanders who decided the rules of war still mattered. The prisoners ate their rations and slowly rebuilt their strength. They lived in camps that were still prisons but no longer execution grounds. They waited for the war's legal and diplomatic aftermath to sort itself out. And they remembered the trucks arriving at the gates, the American soldiers distributing food, the moment when starvation became survival.